around 2.7 million Sri Lankans were pushed into poverty as a result of the economic crisis. Over 60% of those in the poorest quintiles do not receive a Samurthi cash transfer. It is not overnight that Sri Lanka will have the Rolls Royce of social protection programs and systems in the world. So we support the government through technical assistance or, of course, financial assistance. So the government passed, obviously, the new program, so it has its obviously legal basis.
COVID and the economic crisis has doubled poverty in Sri Lanka, according to the World Bank. The poverty here is being made worse by the misallocation of limited resources available for social protection. The Samruddhi program, the government's main program for cash transfers to the poor, has been criticized for its poor targeting. Only 36% of the poorest 20% of Sri Lanka's population receives Samruddhi cash transfers. A new social protection program is now being designed and implemented. The World Bank is supporting this work. René Solano, a human development specialist at the World Bank, joins us here at the Echelon studio to discuss the design and implementation of social protection programs with a special reference to what's happening in Sri Lanka. So, René, it's good to have you here in Echelon Studios. Let's start here, René. Sri Lanka had a good track record of reducing poverty over several decades until we hit in 2020 the pandemic and then followed by the economic crisis. Can you tell us what's happened to poverty in the last few years in Sri Lanka?
Well, first and foremost, thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Before I talk to Sri Lanka, I think it's important to also set the global context. A lot of countries around the world are grappling with increased levels of poverty and also vulnerability. Just in 2020 alone, the World Bank estimated that around 97 million people worldwide were pushed into poverty as a result of COVID-19. So it is not a Sri Lanka specific challenge. Now, in terms of Sri Lanka, it is true that the economic crisis, according to recent estimates, has doubled. In 2021, we estimated that the poverty rate in Sri Lanka was around 13.1%. And in 2022, the estimate was around 25.6%. And of course, that's only in terms of poverty. Around 2.7 million Sri Lankans were pushed into poverty as a result of the economic crisis in that year alone. And of course, a lot of the poor are also basically poorer. So it's not only about the number of people who are being pushed into poverty, but also people who are poorer with important consequences for social protection. Now, that's on poverty. But now also it's important to recognize that a lot of people are also vulnerable to poverty. We see in 2021 as well that 5.7% of Sri Lankans are just below 10% above the poverty line.
Right.
And also 5.6% of Sri Lankans are between 10 and 20% above the poverty line. They are one shock away from poverty.
So our poverty rate is, according to your estimate, is around 25%, and there are close to 10% of the population that's like potentially one shock away from falling into poverty. So even a personal crisis can push them into poverty.
Absolutely. And that can be any type, as you said, any type of shock on income. And I also think it's important to recognize that this is just economic crisis. In addition to that, of course, we had the COVID-19 shock on poverty. In 2019, as you know, the poverty rate here in Sri Lanka was around 11 or 12%. And that increased to around 1.5 percentage points in 2020, pushing an additional 300,000 Sri Lankans into poverty. So I think we see in Sri Lanka a plethora of shocks that have been compounded to have an enormous impact on poverty and vulnerability.
Can you define for us what you mean by poverty? I'm assuming this is a income-based measure for a family or an individual. How do you define poverty?
So we have different definitions
Sure.
of poverty precisely to measure and track the multidimensional nature of poverty and and deprivation as well. So the first definition that we have is, of course, a national poverty line. And that national poverty line identifies the share of the population that basically do not meet basic needs as stipulated by the country. So that's one definition of the poverty line. The second definition is basically an international poverty line. And for Sri Lanka, it's around $3.65 per day per person. And that's basically relevant for low and middle income countries. Many South Asian countries use that poverty line. And the good thing about that poverty line is that allows comparisons across different poverty lines. And in addition to that, as I mentioned, we also use the multi-dimension poverty measures because, as I said, poverty is multidimensional. So you also have to understand what other different elements come into play into poverty.
So if you had to unpack this, you said 3.6 US dollars per person per day. So that's at current exchange rates. It's a little over 1,000 rupees per person per day.
More or less.
A family of 4, that would be 4,000 rupees a day. And you multiply this into a number of days in a month to figure how much income they would essentially need.
Plus the average household side, right? So you have obviously a 4-point-something number of households, number of members in a household. So that defines the poverty line, and then obviously that is defined by the country.
Sure. Can you contrast that with what we call the official poverty line in Sri Lanka? I think the government's Census and Statistics Department calculates an official poverty line. You briefly referred to it. Can you contrast these two? How are these two different?
So basically what I mentioned is that, first and foremost, these are estimates, right? I mean, estimates that we use survey data to prepare, right? So one of the estimates is basically, as I said, the national poverty line. But the other one is the international relevant poverty line for Sri Lanka. And that's why they're not equivalent, but they're similar. But the reason why we calculate the latter is precisely to allow for those comparisons.
Right. So, so the government's official poverty line, the national poverty line, is based on survey data. Does the World Bank do its own surveys to figure out where the international poverty line is, or how do you do that?
No. We use national survey data to actually assess the poverty line. Otherwise, it would be a bit misleading for us. And plus, we don't necessarily do surveys. We support governments sometimes through the Bureau of Statistics, for example, to actually carry those survey data.
And just to contrast the two lines, can you tell us the World Bank's poverty line is about 25%, somewhere there. Where is the national poverty line currently?
Just to clarify, so basically this 25.6% that I alluded to is an estimate. So basically derived from the HICE survey of 2019. So what we
HICE is Household Income and Expenditure Survey.
Exactly. So basically what we do is we use that HICE survey, and we actually change or to take into account the different macroeconomic variables that have affected the country, and then we calculate how we think based on that national survey data, poverty has increased. So it is an estimate. So I just want to make that clear.
Sure. René, you mentioned briefly that, okay, income poverty is one aspect of it, and that poverty is multidimensional. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that to us?
So obviously income is an important factor in poverty, but oftentimes we don't only rely on income, because basically income is declared. So many people could either provide different figures in terms of income. So that's why we also we take into account other factors that may affect poor people, and this includes education, health, access to social protection, etc. Because we believe those are also very good proxies for people's vulnerabilities across the world.
If you look at countries of a similar state of development as Sri Lanka is, and everybody's had to face COVID as a crisis all around the world, how is Sri Lanka's poverty rate comparable? If you compare Sri Lanka's poverty rate, what does it tell you?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the impact of the COVID-19 crisis was one, but then that's compounded by the economic crisis. So it's very difficult to tell you how to compare the current poverty rate precisely because this shock is very specific to Sri Lanka. But needless to say, having 25.6% of people living in poverty in a country is pretty high, and it's actually alarming.
The World Bank has been working alongside the government, I think, and you've been part of such an initiative to help improve social protection and help improve the government's social protection program. We popularly know this as Samurdhi. It's only one part of social protection, but it's also the biggest part of government's social protection program. And there's a lot of criticism about Samurdhi, about its effectiveness in tackling poverty. Do you, as an independent person looking, as an independent institution looking at this, do you think that criticism is founded? What is wrong with Samurdhi?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, it's important to define what we mean by social protection.
Sure.
Social protection is, as you know, is basically helps people manage life cycle risks. One of the risks is risks to poverty. Mm-hmm. Hence the cash transfers.
Sure.
But there's also many risks that we face across the life cycle. Risks to unemployment, risks to disability, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's important to recognize the broader meaning of social protection. With regards to Samurdhi, which is one cash transfer program within the broader social protection schemes, it is true that Samurdhi is facing important exclusion and inclusion errors. A recent estimate suggests that around 37 or 38% of those in the poorest income quintile receive Samurdhi cash transfers, which is relatively low. And 5% of those in the richest quintile actually also receive Samurdhi cash transfers. So that's very important.
But so a quintile is you take your population and divide it by 5, and then you have the lowest 20% and the highest earning 20%. Okay.
Absolutely. Sorry. And then in addition to that, this is not only a problem of Samurdhi. I mean, you see this high levels of exclusion and inclusion errors across different cash transfer programs, including the categorical cash transfer programs that Sri Lanka has, right? So I wanted to make that clear. It's not only about Samurdhi, but it's also these challenges are faced by other social protection programs. Now, it is also important to mention that that a lot of different countries have cash transfer programs, and a lot of different these programs face important exclusion and inclusion challenges around the world. And what we learn about COVID is that those countries that had robust and resilient social protection systems were the ones who were able to effectively and efficiently respond to COVID-19. And those countries that have those systems will be able to better address the next impending shock that they will have in the future.
You mentioned that perhaps the poorest 20% of Sri Lankans, more than 30% of them were not receiving particularly Samurdhi benefits or any cash transfer benefits. And 5% of the richest people in Sri Lanka or richest families in Sri Lanka were receiving these benefits. It sounds atrocious to somebody. Is it that bad that you have a poverty alleviation program that it excludes 30% of the poorest?
Well, just to correct the figure, so actually, over 60% of those in the poorest quintiles do not receive Samurdhi cash transfers. So it's actually it's higher. It's a lot
much
more
worse.
It's much worse, unfortunately.
Right.
So which means every challenge has an opportunity. I think there's a lot of opportunities for these cash transfers programs to improve the provision of cash transfers to targeted individuals. And it is also important to note that improving cash transfer programs and systems take a bit of time. It is not overnight that Sri Lanka will have the Rolls Royce of social protection programs and systems in the world.
So you are part of a World Bank team amongst other things, that is looking at social protection. And the World Bank has had a project from commencing in 2017, going up till 2023, that looks at improving Sri Lanka's cash transfers. What did you find was the reason for such very poor targeting? If 60% of the poorest people, the 20% of the poor, 60% of the poorest people aren't receiving cash benefits out of these programs, how did that come about?
So yes, you alluded first and foremost to that World Bank Finance Social Safety Net project. And it is important to know that that project, the main objective was to support Sri Lanka in the development of a social protection system. And let me perhaps allude to what are the key elements of a social protection system, which includes obviously targeting. So the first thing, there are many challenges that the countries face to build these systems. The first one is communications. A lot of countries do not do sufficient communication, sufficient outreach, and therefore people do not know about these programs, and therefore they cannot register, and therefore they cannot be provided targeted assistance. So that's one important challenge. The second important challenge that I think is critical is financing. In Sri Lanka, just to give you an example, Sri Lanka only spends 0.6% of its GDP on social safety net or cash, or mostly cash transfers. That's below the average of South Asia of over 1.0% of their GDP. So finance, if you don't allocate sufficient resources to cash transfers, that is a big challenge, and that can also prevent you from the cash transfers not reaching the intended, reaching sufficient people, rather, especially those intended beneficiaries. The third challenge that I think it's important to recognize, and that also it's linked to targeting, is capacity. A lot of countries grapple with low capacity to implement these programs. A program can be beautifully designed, but in social protection specifically, if you do not have the capacity at all levels to implement the program, then you will not do a good job at reaching the intended beneficiaries. The fourth challenge that I think also is very important, it's the lack of a social registry. Which is part of, as I mentioned, the system. And a social registry is a database of potential beneficiaries of social programs. And in Sri Lanka, before the crisis, even though we were supporting the development of a social registry in the country, did not have that social registry. Without a social registry, a country, unfortunately, cannot identify those who actually deserve and merit to get assistance from the government. And last but not least, another very important challenge is that of coordination. And governance. And I think here, if you don't have the proper governance and also implementation arrangements in place that allow for effective and efficient coordination mechanisms to deliver these social programs, then you will not have a system that reaches the poor and the vulnerable.
So you're talking about 5 things here that are crucial to get right to have a successful social protection program: communication, funding, implementation, a social registry, what you call a social registry, and the good governance of it, right? I'm sure you'd suggest that all 5 of these are challenges in Sri Lanka, as probably they are in many other countries. But if you look at why we're doing so poorly in terms of targeting, I'm sure some of these will stick out as ones that are more problematic than others. Which ones would those be?
Yeah, I mean, the World Bank has not done a thorough analysis of the key binding constraints of poor targeting. But, broadly speaking, I would have to say that one, it is indeed the lack of a social registry. As I said, Sri Lanka did not have one before. Right now, we are supporting the government to develop one. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. 2, and I think the other aspect is also about capacity. So how do you then ensure proper enumeration of people, proper registration of people, if you don't have the capacity, both in terms of human resources, but also in terms of know-how, to actually implement your project well? As I said, social protection is all about implementation, not only about design. So I would have to identify those two main areas where Sri Lanka, I think, could focus moving forward.
And Sri Lanka has a law. Sri Lanka has a Samurdhi Act that has governed the authority and the large staff it has. So it strikes me, at least as somebody who's watching from afar, that we have the resources in place and a large staff in the Samurdhi authority, and yet we have not been able to do the fundamental things like have a robust social registry in place. It can look a little shocking from the outside.
Well, yes, but I mean, it must be important to recognize that, as I mentioned, the development of these systems and these social registries take time, are very, very difficult to implement. I come from Latin America, where we have pretty good social protection systems, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, and they were not developed overnight. It was a process, a long process, and also a process that required high levels of ownership and high levels of basically support from the government.
Sure. However, from what we've heard in the news, and we've also heard that the World Bank is sort of potentially looking at extending its support for social protection in Sri Lanka beyond the project that we mentioned, which went from 2017 to 2023. So you're looking at extending support. Apparently, there's some changes afoot. We are talking about a welfare benefits board, that may come into the picture. Can you outline for us what the World Bank's work in this area is alongside the government, what you're doing alongside the government to support the government in changing the structure of social protection in Sri Lanka?
So, as you may know, the World Bank does not implement projects. We support the government through technical assistance or, of course, financial assistance. So, in this regard, we have been working very closely with the government in a couple of areas. One, at the strategic level, basically supporting the government to draft a social protection and strategic framework that in a way will define the way forward for social protection in the country. One element of that is, of course, the social registry, the delivery of targeted cash transfers, etc. So we have been supporting the government on that front. So that's one thing. The second thing that we are also supporting the government with is more along the lines of accompanying the reform process through technical assistance. And by this, I really mean try to basically bring international good practices to inform the design of the new scheme, Aswesuma, and also bring international good practices to really inform all of the different aspects that I alluded to before in terms of the delivery chain or the delivery system of the new cash transfer scheme. So this is the second, I think, way we have tried to support the government in this reform process. And last but not least, as you allude to, we have this potential of new project in the pipeline. It's called Social Protection Project. And basically, once the system is established, then we would then come in with the financing of some or part of the new Aswesuma scheme, and also continue supporting the building system agenda, the system building agenda that I alluded to specifically with regards to the social registry.
So you're referring to this new scheme as, the sort of brand the government is likely to use is Aswesuma. Aswesuma. And can you tell us if the legal basis underlying this scheme is different to what has been available previously? Again, social protection is several cash transfer schemes, but if we talk about Samurdhi as the main one that has existed, are we going to use the same legal foundations, or is this a new one?
So the government passed, obviously, the new program, so it has its obviously legal basis. But in terms of more institutionally, as you mentioned earlier, you alluded to the Welfare Benefit Board, which is basically a board within the Ministry of Finance that, in a way, coordinates not only the design but also the delivery of this new targeted scheme. So that is a major departure of the new scheme. Having said that, the WBB, the Welfare Benefit Board, was envisioned as part of an earlier act in 2002. It was just dormant. It was never operationalized. So I think that's a very important progress in terms of the institutional dimension of this new scheme. So that's one aspect. The second aspect of this new scheme is basically that it redefines and redesigns the way the schemes, the design of the schemes, it's themselves. It basically divides the population into 4 different groups based on their level of poverty and vulnerability, and provides targeted support and adequate support to those people. So I think that's another major programmatic design revision to the way cash transfers are delivered in Sri Lanka.
So in implementation, if the new scheme is under the finance ministry, then also in a very practical sense, what would essentially the government do with the existing staff and the law and all that? Do they transfer that capacity into the new system, or how do you deal with that?
That's a very important question, and I think that's a very strategic question, because it deals with redefining the role of Samurthi. And I think the government, must obviously work on that redefinition of Samurthi. Having said that, what I think it's important is that Samurthi will continue to exist. You have other elements or other activities delivered by Samurthi. One of them was the cash transfer. But then you also have important livelihoods activities, provision of basically employment opportunities to poor and vulnerable, that are critical. And why they're critical? Because Sri Lanka will go from an emergency situation into more of a recovery situation soon. And of course, cash transfers and social protection is one aspect of the equation. You also have employment programs that really, really are required moving forward to enable Sri Lankans to have sustainable livelihoods. So Samurthi will continue to have a role, and a very important role.
Sure. Samurthi, I don't know if you know the numbers. Samurthi must be employing 10, 16,000 people. So it's a large human resource that now doesn't have to do cash transfers. So it possibly can also, the government needs a long-term strategy of what to do with Samurthi.
Absolutely.
But it is not part of what the World Bank is helping the government strategize with.
Not at the moment, but it is bigger. It's part of the bigger, as I said, social protection strategy that we have been supporting the government with. But we're not really involved in the details of this new vision for Samurthi in the country.
One of the criticisms of social protection in the past in Sri Lanka has been that the funding aspect that you referred to, that the poor or those who were thought as deserving of help were receiving very small grants. Under Samurdhi, it was like 5,000 rupees, and then during COVID, went maybe up to 7,000 rupees. How likely is it that a new system, a new welfare benefits board or Aswasama, can do better than this? Is that the vision, to do better than what we have done under Samurdhi?
So that's another very, very good question, because it goes to the heart of a policy issue: coverage versus adequacy of benefits.
Sure.
We live in a fiscally constrained environment. Sri Lanka is not any different. So all countries have to decide on the number of people they covered, and basically the amount that they give people, right? So that's an important policy question. Now, with regards to Sasuma itself, I think that the government has recognized that increased levels of inflation have really eroded people's ability to buy anything, and they have adjusted the amount of the transfers across these different 4 categories that I alluded to, with a lot more money being provided to those that are in the bottom 20% of the income distribution.
Is it likely that okay, so you talk about this challenge, coverage versus benefits, right? And talk to us as an expert, okay? Given Sri Lanka's circumstances, the shocks that we've experienced and the prevalence of poverty, how should an ideally designed system approach this trade-off between the number of people you cover and how much then you can distribute to individuals or families?
So look, I mean, when we look at the number of people that will benefit from the new scheme, it's over 2 million households. This translates into 40% of the population? Not bad for a cash transfer to cover 40% of the entire population. And in addition to that, as I mentioned, basically the adequacy of benefits or the amount given to people, at least the bottom 20%, will increase. So Sri Lanka is doing both, actually. Is actually reaching 40% of the population and is providing adequate support to those that are in the lowest 20%.
So, by its design, the new scheme, Aswasuma, is not going to transfer a uniform amount of money to all those deemed to be in poverty.
No. As I mentioned, so the bottom 20%, so the actual eligible beneficiaries are divided into 4 different categories.
Okay.
The 2 lower categories, meaning those that are in the lowest part of the income distribution, will receive significantly more than what they're receiving before under Samurthy, and those that are basically closer to the poverty line or less poor, relatively speaking, will receive less based on their levels of poverty and vulnerability.
You also suggested that about 10% of Sri Lanka's population are like teetering at the edge of the international poverty line, which is $3.6 per person per day. So we are at 25% poverty on that poverty line, and there's another 10% of the population that's close to poverty. So when you talk about a 40% coverage, we are essentially extending some support to this 10% also. Is that understanding correct? From the poverty line upwards.
No. So this is basically, again, poverty is relative. So we are, or the government rather, not we, but the government is actually providing assistance to the lowest, 40% of the population in terms of the income distribution. As you correctly alluded to, in addition to that, those who are not poor but vulnerable, that I mentioned before, are close to the poverty line. So then the policy question is, what happens to them? And how do we really ensure that they are covered in the event that they fall into poverty? And I think that's why it is important for a social protection system to be dynamic. It is important for the social registry to be able to, or anyone who feels that they deserve social protection because of a shock, because that's the definition of a social protection, to actually go and register and their application be evaluated. And whether if they fell into poverty, well, then they can come into the social protection scheme of the government. And that's why it's important to have this dynamic social registry I alluded to.
Right. Poverty can also be, like you said, dynamic. So in this scheme that the government is envisaging, people can go in and out of the scheme, I suppose, right? In a practical sense, when you're talking about 2 million people registered, what are the challenges of administering or managing such a scheme?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I think it's important for every certification process of these 2 million people to happen every 2 or 3 years.
Right.
So it is critical for this dynamic social protection system that I alluded to. So that's one thing. The second thing that I think also very important, because poverty, people's poverty status change, is to revisit the design of schemes and whether we are indeed covering sufficient people, indeed providing them with adequate support, et cetera. So revisiting the design is also important to have flexibility based on this changing conditions. So I think those 2 elements of, in terms of policy, are critical for Sri Lanka moving forward. But they require, just to answer your question, they require a lot of capacity. And this is why I was referring to as capacity as being a very, very important challenge for Sri Lanka and many other countries. How do you then recertify 2 million people, 2 million households rather, every 2 or 3 years? Fortunately, we did see that Sri Lanka recently did a pretty good job at enabling the registration process of 3.7 million households in record time, really. And they also did a very good job in actually validating the data of this 3.7 million households in record time as well. So I think there are promising things that we can take from this experience, this initial experience in Sri Lanka, moving forward for the country.
So if the communication were good, I suppose there'd be people who think they're poor who would come and register, right? But as you suggest, it needs to be validated. What are the likely challenges in that validation process? Do you have teams of people visit them in their households? How do you then figure out what their income is? Based on what?
So let's assume that the communication is no longer an issue and that people actually register. So let's take that as a given your question.
So people are putting their hands up and saying, "Hey, I'm poor. You should really consider."
And they come and register
Sure.
in the database in this social register. So let's assume that's no longer a challenge. So one important challenge in that respect is actually having a lot of capacity to actually go to every household and validate this data. And by this data, I mean really, the data that people use to register. There are a couple of indicators, the over 20 indicators that these enumerators, what we call enumerators, have to go to the households and verify to make sure that the information that provided by people who are probably eligible is accurate. So that's one challenge, right? The capacity of people to the enumerators to go into these households. The second challenge that in this process that I think it's also important to recognize is the fact that sometimes even if enumerators go to these households, sometimes there's all kinds of issues preventing the collection of the data itself. We see a lot of people, for example, that are not in the house because they had to go to work or because they're not providing the adequate information that enumerators need. So that's also a challenge because if data is not validated, then they cannot really receive cash transfers. And we saw that out of the 3.7 million households that I mentioned that registered for this cash transfer program, around 3.3 or 3.4 million that their data was validated. So there was a gap. And we really need to, or the government really needs to understand why 300,000 or 400,000 households their data was not validated. So that's also an important challenge moving forward.
Some countries, it appears, have been successful in using technology to help bridge these gaps in data. I mean, India has got a digital ID that, as we've come to learn, they're using very effectively to tackle issues like poverty. How can technology in general be better deployed in a place like Sri Lanka, you think?
I think technology is key to improve precisely the governance of the system.
Right.
So there are a couple of things that Sri Lanka has already done that I think are important. One, the fact that you use tablets to actually go to the households and verify their data.
Sure.
Is technology. And actually, once you actually capture that data, you're able to rank beneficiaries based on their score. So that in itself is already a good step in the right direction. The second thing that I think Sri Lanka did well is they provided, following this validation process of data, beneficiaries, they provided QR codes to ensure that from the beneficiary perspective, of possible beneficiaries, their data was accurately inputted in this process. And I think that is critical because it provides possible beneficiaries the right to complain in case their data was not properly input. So that's another innovation that in the role of technology in this process. And of course, the last but not least, I mean, you really have to develop a good social registry. Social registry is by itself some form of technology as well, and also very strong and robust monitoring and evaluation systems to track basically progress in the implementation of programs, as well as grievance and redress mechanisms to ensure that people have the right to complain if they did not receive cash transfers or they feel that they were not included in the process.
Has the World Bank worked with countries where a digital ID has been integrated into this program? Does that lead to more robust governance in such situations?
Yes, I mean, I myself have worked in the Middle East, for example, and on a couple of projects that link digital ID to social registries and to the provision of cash transfers in this case. And evidently, I mean, that's an important innovation that countries must take into account moving forward. You mentioned the case of India, but there are several others that use biometric IDs, and they link that to be able to identify potential beneficiaries of programs. So for sure, I mean, I think that that is a good area to explore moving forward here in the country, but you don't necessarily need a single biometric ID to actually do this. Look at Brazil, and other countries. Other countries are implementing effectively and efficiently cash transfers without a biometric ID. So it can be done otherwise. So it's not a precondition to actually provide cash transfer programs.
Sri Lanka is or was a upper middle income country. Now our status is a little bit in flux, but let's assume we are in that region, right? It suggests at least by that term, which the World Bank is very familiar with, it's a World Bank classification, right? That Sri Lanka has overcome the sorts of challenges that, maybe around poverty, right? What is the World Bank's experience? Do upper middle income countries require significant funding, operational allocations from the budget to deal with poverty? Is that a thing? Is that a norm?
Well, I mean, look at how much money quote unquote rich, forget about upper middle income countries, OECD countries, the United States of America. Look at how much money they spent on social protection programs. So it is important to allocate sufficient resources for social protection, because anyone, as I mentioned, can fall into poverty. And it's not only about the equity angle, meaning poverty reduction as well. It is about life cycle risks. That is the core of social protection. So I think definitely, if you look at how much money rich, quote unquote, rich countries spend, it's very significant.
The World Bank is discussing supporting the government's strategy around its poverty reduction or its social protection program that is being, Aadhaar, that is being redesigned now. What form will this support take? Is this technical assistance? Are you giving some money to the budget that can then be, used directly to distribute as benefits to beneficiaries? What form of support will this be?
So this is purely technical assistance. So we're working in close collaboration with National Planning Department, basically with the Ministry of Finance, to actually establish this social protection, the strategic framework, as I said, to define the priorities moving forward. So we're not really, for now, financing any type of activities included in that strategic framework beyond the cash transfers, the new social protection program that I alluded to.
So are you referring to the program that you currently have in operation, or the one that you're proposing to?
Well, the current program is coming to an end this summer.
Sure.
And then the new program will hopefully be approved soon in the next couple of weeks. So beyond the new program, we don't have anything else in terms of financing for social protection.
This new program, the current program is about $75 million over a period of 6 years or so, largely for technical assistance. I'm assuming the tabs that the people who go out on the field to collect the data, ultimately resulted from funding from the World Bank. That sort of funding is what World Bank provided in the last 6 years.
So in the last 6 years for this $75 million project, as I mentioned, had a couple of components. One is the social registry. So some of the money went through the procuring of the firm to establish the social register, et cetera. But it's also important to recognize that this project was restructured in the middle of the implementation, towards the end, and some of the loan proceeds were reallocated to support the COVID-19 response of the government in the country.
If the World Bank's board were to approve a new program, what quantum of funding over what period of time approximately would Sri Lanka be asking for?
So we're still discussing with the authorities in terms of duration, in terms of amounts, et cetera. But what I think is even more important is that a lot of the different development partners in the country are supporting Sri Lanka. We see, for example, that ADB is coming into the equation of social protection, or has come to the equation in terms of social protection. So I think it's important to see this not as a World Bank intervention or financing, but rather as an international community where we, the development partners, UN and others, care about improving the social protection system in the country.
Is the new program likely to be limited to technical assistance? I'm just trying to figure, you mentioned it was likely, or will there be any budget?
No, the new program has has budget associated with it. As I said, we're still discussing the final touches on it, but it will support the new scheme, as a SUMA scheme that I alluded to, and as well will continue to support this development of systems that are robust, but also systems that are adaptable to ensure Sri Lanka is prepared to actually deliver cash transfers next time it unfortunately faces a new shock.
Right. René, anything you need to add to round off this interview?
No, I think it's also just wanted to conclude by saying that social protection is, of course, critical, both for productivity and also economic growth. But one thing that I think it's important to note is the agenda of jobs and how social protection can be linked, or is usually linked, to actually sustainable livelihoods. And we are supporting the government right now and other development partners in designing a new, what we call economic inclusion pilot that will precisely link cash transfer beneficiaries to job opportunities. And I think that's important as Sri Lanka recovers from this crisis.
René, thank you for joining Echelon.
Thank you very much.